The envelope was sitting on Renata's kitchen counter when she got home from her 12-hour shift at the hospital. Plain white. Official. The kind with a clear plastic window that shows your name typed in cold black ink. She almost didn't open it. After a shift like that, 3 codes, 1 difficult family in the ICU waiting room, and a broken heating unit in the break room that made the whole wing smell like burnt plastic. Renata Blake just wanted to eat leftover soup and fall face first into her bed. She was 31 years old, a registered nurse with 7 years of night shifts under her belt, and she had learned to defer bad news until she had at least eaten something. But something made her stop. Something about the return address. Something about the specific weight of the envelope in her hand, the way it sat heavier than junk mail should. She tore it open at the kitchen counter, still wearing her scrubs. The words Superior Court of the County stared back at her from the top of the page, and for a full 5 seconds, Renata's brain simply refused to process them. Her parents, David and Maureen Blake, were petitioning the court to compel her to release funds from what the document called a jointly accumulated family savings account, in the amount of $47,000. The petition had been filed 3 weeks ago. The hearing date was in 18 days. Renata read the page 3 times. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, just sat right down on the cold tile, because her legs stopped working properly. She hadn't spoken to her parents in 4 months. Not since the blowout at her sister Tanya's birthday dinner, the one where her mother had looked across the table and said, with terrifying calm, "You have always been the selfish one, Renata. Even as a child." For months of silence, which Renata had been using to heal, to breathe, to finally start sleeping through the night without waking up at 3 a.m. replaying old arguments. And now this. The $47,000 in question was not a jointly accumulated anything. It was a savings account Renata had opened at 22, funded entirely by her own paychecks, her overtime, her carefully packed lunches, and her years of never taking a vacation. It was the money she had been saving to buy a house. Her house. Her escape. But her parents were claiming otherwise. And somehow, they had convinced a court to issue a summons. Renata sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, the soup forgotten, the tiredness forgotten, her whole body running on pure stunned adrenaline. She kept coming back to one question. How had they done this? How had they built a legal argument around money they had never touched, never contributed to, never so much as asked about? She didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question was buried inside a deed she had never seen, and it was about to change everything. She finally got up, walked to her bedroom, and pulled out the business card she'd kept in her nightstand drawer for 2 years. She had hoped she'd never need it. She had been wrong. The card read, Diane Okafor, ESQ, Estate and Property Law. Below the name, a phone number Renata had memorized without meaning to. She dialed. It rang 4 times. Then Diane picked up, and Renata said the only 3 words she could manage. I need help. What Diane said next made Renata's hand go very still on the phone. Diane Okafor had a voice like a woman who had heard every story and was still paying attention. She was 53, a sole practitioner with an office above a dry cleaner on Halsted Street, and she had the particular gift of making complicated things feel manageable. Not easy, but manageable. Renata met her the next morning at 7:30, before Renata's next shift. She brought the summons, her bank statements going back 9 years, and a folder of every text message she'd saved from the last 2 years of conflict with her parents. She had organized them chronologically. Diane noticed that immediately. You anticipated this, Diane said, not as a question. I anticipated something, Renata said. I just didn't know what shape it would take. Diane read through the petition carefully while Renata sat across from her, drinking coffee that was too hot and doing it anyway. The office was quiet. Outside, the city was starting to move, traffic building on Halsted, someone's delivery truck reversing with its persistent beeping. Renata focused on that sound to keep herself calm. Their argument, Diane finally said, is that you used family money as seed capital for this account. She set the papers down. Specifically, they're claiming your grandfather left money to the family collectively, not to you individually, and that you used a portion of that money to open this savings account in 2016. Renata blinked. My grandfather left me a gift, $2,000, for graduating nursing school. Was there paperwork? It was a check, from his personal account, with congratulations, Rennie written in the memo line. Diane nodded slowly. Do you still have that check? The image of it, Renata thought back. She had kept her bank records. She had not necessarily kept the scanned image of a check from 9 years ago. The uncertainty of it sat in her stomach like a stone. But there was something else. Something Diane had said that had snagged in Renata's mind like a thread caught on a nail. Your grandfather. The petition had referenced her grandfather specifically. Franklin Blake, dead 11 years. A quiet man who had worked for 40 years as a machinist, saved meticulously, and then spent his last decade giving things away to people he loved. What else did he leave? Diane asked carefully. And Renata said something that surprised even herself. I don't actually know. She had been 20 years old when Franklin died. There had been a small funeral, a gathering at her parents' house afterward, some quiet conversations she had not been included in because she was young and had gone to sit with her grandmother in the kitchen. She had received the $2,000 check and assumed that was her portion, and she had never thought to ask about the rest. Her parents had handled Franklin's estate. Her parents had always handled everything. Diane was already writing something down. I'm going to need you to let me pull the probate records for your grandfather's estate, she said. Can you do that? Sign an authorization for me. Of course. But why? Diane looked up, and there was something careful in her expression. The look of someone who knows more than she's saying because she needs to be sure first. Because, she said, the way this petition is worded is very specific. Too specific. They're not just claiming the seed money argument. They're claiming a legal stake in your financial trajectory. That kind of language doesn't come from nowhere, Renata. Someone coached them. Or someone showed them something. Renata drove to work that afternoon replaying every word of that conversation. She pulled her nursing duties like a professional, checked vitals, reviewed charts, comforted a frightened man in room 4 who was convinced he was dying and turned out to just have a very dramatic case of anxiety. She did all of it. But somewhere underneath all of it, the question turned and turned. What had her grandfather left? And who had known about it when she hadn't? She found out that evening. And it was so much worse than she'd imagined. If you're still watching right now, you're exactly the kind of viewer I love. Subscribe so I can keep giving you stories that touch your heart. Hit that bell so you never miss what happens next. Diane called at 8:45, just as Renata was pulling off her hospital badge in the parking garage. I have the probate records, Diane said. Are you sitting down? Renata leaned against her car. Just tell me. Your grandfather Franklin Blake did not die with a simple estate. In addition to his personal savings, which were split between your parents and your grandmother, who passed in 2019, he owned a piece of property. A lot in Eastwick County, roughly 2 acres, purchased in 1987. Diane paused. He left that property to you, Renata. Solely and entirely to you. The deed was filed with the county in 2013 and has been sitting there for 11 years. The parking garage was very quiet. Somewhere above her, a car door slammed. The fluorescent lights buzzed. I didn't know, Renata said. It came out very small. I know you didn't. Diane's voice was gentle but precise. Your parents were named as co-trustees of the bequest with instructions to inform you upon your 25th birthday. You are 31. 6 years. They had held that information for 6 years past the point they were legally required to deliver it. Renata had pressed her back flat against her car, and she was distantly aware that her knees were not entirely trustworthy at the moment. She thought about every conversation she could remember having with her parents about money. Every time they had suggested she was irresponsible. Every time her mother had implied she didn't understand how the world worked. Every time they had used money as leverage. We can help you, but you need to come home more, but you need to be more available for your sister, but you need to remember where you came from. They had known. The entire time they had been performing generosity and patience and long-suffering parental sacrifice, they had been sitting on a deed with her name on it. What's the property worth? Renata asked. Another pause. Diane was careful with this kind of information, always building the context before the number. Property values in Eastwick County have appreciated significantly in the last decade. Based on comparable sales, we're looking at current market value in the range of $210,000. $210,000. Renata had been scraping together $47,000 over 9 years of 12-hour shifts, packed lunches, and no vacations. Her grandfather had left her more than 4 times that amount, and her parents had used their trustee authority to simply not tell her. The property is currently listed, Diane said. I'm sorry. As of 6 weeks ago, the Eastwick lot is listed for sale with a real estate agency. Your parents filed a sale authorization through a quiet title action 3 months ago, claiming the property had been abandoned by the intended beneficiary. A pause. The buyer has made an offer. The buyer had made an offer. Her parents had maneuvered her into a court proceeding over $47,000 while simultaneously, quietly, trying to sell a $200,000 piece of land that had her name on it. The petition had not been about the savings at all. The petition had been a distraction. Renata stood in that parking garage for a very long time after the call ended. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Her breath came in slow, measured counts the way she had taught herself to breathe when she was sitting with a patient who was scared. She was scared too, but she was also something else now. Something that had been building quietly for 31 years, that had been confused for selfishness and ingratitude and the inability to be a team player, but was actually something much simpler. She was done. She called Diane back. "Tell me what we need to do to stop that sale." What Diane told her made her pull out a notepad in the parking garage and start writing, because she was going to need to remember every word of it. The courtroom was smaller than Renata had expected. She had built it up in her mind into something cathedral-sized, something that matched the scale of what was being decided, but it was just a beige room with fluorescent lights and chairs that made a faint scraping noise on the tile floor. Her parents were already seated at the petitioner's table when she arrived with Diane. Her father David was wearing his good gray suit, the one he saved for church and formal occasions. Her mother Maureen had her hair done. They both looked composed, prepared, the way people look when they have rehearsed this moment. They had not expected a fight. They had expected Renata to show up without a lawyer, perhaps, or to not show up at all, and for the proceedings to go the way they'd planned. They did not look at her when she entered. Tanya was not there. Renata had wondered about that. Tanya, 26, her parents' clear favorite, perpetually in the middle of some crisis that required collective family management, had not come. Renata didn't know yet what that absence meant, but she filed it away. The opposing counsel was a man named Bernard Stills, a heavy-set attorney in a brown jacket, who spoke with the confidence of someone who had filed 100 of these and expected all of them to end the same way. He laid out the petition's argument smoothly. The grandfather's gift, the seed capital claim, the family's collective interest in the savings account. He made it sound reasonable. He made Renata sound like someone who had taken something that wasn't hers and gotten rich off it while her family struggled. Renata watched her mother's face while Stills spoke. Maureen Blake was 60 years old and still beautiful in the severe, composed way she had always been. There was no guilt on her face. There was only certainty. The certainty of a woman who believed that providing food and shelter for 18 years gave her a permanent stake in whatever her children built afterward. Then Diane stood up. She was physically not an imposing woman. She was compact, precise, dressed in navy blue, her natural hair pulled back from her face. But the way she moved to the podium had a quality Renata had noticed the first morning they met. She moved like someone who knew exactly which cards she was holding. "Your Honor," Diane said, "the petitioners have asked this court to order the respondent to release funds from her personal savings account on the grounds of family contribution. Before we address the merits of that claim, I'd like to submit several documents into evidence." She laid a folder on the clerk's desk. "These are the probate records for the estate of Franklin Blake, filed in this county in 2013. I'd particularly like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit C." Bernard Stills had gone very still. Renata's mother turned her head. Not much, just a fraction. And for the first time that morning, she looked directly at Renata. And what Renata saw in her mother's eyes in that moment was not anger, and it was not guilt, and it was not love. It was the look of someone calculating how much damage had been done and whether any of it could still be managed. It could not. Diane continued. "Exhibit C is the deed to a property in Eastwick County, transferring ownership entirely and solely to Renata Lee Blake upon the death of Franklin Blake, with a trustee arrangement requiring notification to the beneficiary no later than her 25th birthday." She turned a page. The petitioners, David and Maureen Blake, were named co-trustees of this arrangement. The respondent is now 31 years old and received no notification. Another page. Exhibit D is a listing agreement dated 6 weeks ago, signed by David Blake, authorizing the sale of this property through a quiet title action that misrepresented the beneficiary as having abandoned her interest in the property. The courtroom was very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. "The property's current estimated market value," Diane said, "is $212,000. The respondent has been deprived of access to this asset for 6 years through the deliberate non-disclosure of her co-trustees. I am accordingly filing a cross-petition today alleging breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, and seeking both the immediate halt of the pending property sale and full restoration of the asset to its rightful owner. She closed her folder. I would also note that the seed capital argument fails on its own merits, as I have the original bank image of the check Franklin Blake wrote directly to Renata Blake in 2016. She set another page on the clerk's desk, with the notation "Congratulations, Rennie" in the memo line. A personal gift, not a family disbursement. Renata had found that check image the night before, in an old email from her bank that she had almost deleted years ago. She had forwarded it to Diane at midnight, hands shaking, sitting on her bathroom floor. Bernard Stills asked for a recess. The judge granted 15 minutes. Renata sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and breathed. Through the closed courtroom door, she could hear the low sound of her parents' voices, her mother's rising slightly above her father's, and then Stills' voice cutting across both of them. She did not try to hear the words. She did not need to. Diane sat beside her. "You're doing well," she said. "I feel like I'm going to be sick," Renata said. "That's also well," Diane said. "It means you understand what this is." When they returned to the courtroom, Stills stood and announced that the petitioners were withdrawing the savings account petition. The judge noted it and turned to Diane's cross-filing. There was a brief, pointed exchange about the property sale halt, which the judge granted pending a full hearing on the breach of fiduciary claim. The listing was frozen. The buyer's offer was in limbo. It was not over. Not legally. These things are never over in 15 minutes. But her parents were not looking at her with certainty anymore. Renata looked at her father for the first time that day, really looked at him, and saw something she had spent her whole life misreading as disappointment. It had never been disappointment. It had always been fear. Fear of her specifically, of her independence, of what she became when she wasn't kept small enough to manage. She had spent 31 years trying to be manageable. She was done with that too. The full hearing on the breach of fiduciary claim was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the time between, several things happened. Tanya called. This was the call Renata had been bracing for and dreading in equal measure, because Tanya was the variable she had never been able to predict, sometimes an ally, sometimes a weapon their parents used, sometimes genuinely lost in between. The call came on a Thursday evening while Renata was making dinner, and she almost let it go to voicemail. She didn't. "I didn't know," Tanya said without preamble. Her voice was the voice of someone who had been crying recently, and was trying to sound like she hadn't. "About the property. About Grandpa's deed. I didn't know any of it." Renata turned off the stove. "Okay. I don't." A pause. A breath. "I don't know what I'm asking you. I don't know if I'm asking you to forgive them, because I don't think I can ask that. I just wanted you to know I didn't know." Renata leaned against the counter. "Did you know they filed the petition?" Silence. Then, "Yes. Did you ask them to?" Another silence, longer. "They said you had money you weren't sharing. They made it sound like, I don't know what they made it sound like. I was scared we were going to lose the apartment." Tanya was talking about herself and their parents sharing a rental that their parents couldn't fully afford on their own, a situation that had been going on for 3 years, a situation Renata had been quietly asked to help with and had quietly declined because she had seen what that kind of help cost in her family. "You were scared," Renata said. "Not as an accusation. As a fact." "I'm sorry," Tanya said. "And she said it the way you say something when you mean it, but also know it's not enough, and you're saying it anyway, because it's all you have." Renata did not say it's okay because it was not okay. She said, "I hear you," and meant it, and let the silence sit for a moment between them before they found their way to other words. The second thing that happened was that Bernard Stills filed a counter-response to the breach of fiduciary claim on behalf of Renata's parents, arguing that the failure to notify had been an oversight, and that the quiet title action had been taken in good faith based on Renata's prolonged absence from family affairs. It was a thin argument, the kind that reads as plausible in a summary and dissolves under actual scrutiny, and Diane dispatched it with methodical precision over the following weeks. She pulled records, showing when the notification deadline had passed. She pulled emails between her parents and the listing agent that used language no one uses when they believe they're acting in good faith. She built a picture. Renata helped where she could. After her shifts on her days off, at her kitchen table with the same cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop, she pulled everything she had, emails, texts, the one voicemail she'd kept from 2 years ago where her mother had said, "Your grandfather always loved the whole family, not just you," in a context Renata hadn't understood at the time. She understood it now. The third thing that happened was that she drove out to Eastwick County on a Saturday in early October, when the leaves were in full turn, and she found the property. It was a 2-acre lot at the end of a gravel road, bordered on one side by a tree line that was currently blazing orange and gold, on the other by a neighbor's fence and a clear view of open sky. There was no structure on it, just land, flat in the middle and rising gently toward the trees, thick grass gone slightly wild, a rusted metal post at the corner that might have marked something once. Renata stood in the middle of that field for a long time. She thought about Franklin Blake, her grandfather, who had sat quietly through family dinners and said little, who had pressed her hands in both of his when she graduated and said, "You are going somewhere, Rennie, and don't let anyone make you small." She had thought he was being sentimental. She had not understood that he had already taken steps, that he had already done something concrete with his love. He had left her land. In a family that used money as control, he had found the one asset they couldn't easily intercept and put it in her name. He had known. Somehow, the quiet machinist who said little had known exactly what she was going to need. She cried in that field, which embarrassed her even though there was no one to see it. She cried for the 6 years she hadn't known. For the 47,000 she had scraped together in the dark. For every conversation where her mother had made her feel like she was taking up space she hadn't earned. She cried for the version of herself at 25 who had needed this land and hadn't known it existed, and for the version of herself at 31 who was standing on it now, finally. Then she wiped her face and took photographs on her phone, because Diane had asked her to document everything, and practicality was something Renata Blake had always been very good at. The hearing happened on a Tuesday. Diane had told her it would likely be anticlimactic after all the preparation, and Diane had been right. The judge reviewed the fiduciary timeline, reviewed the listing agreement, reviewed Still's good faith argument, and found it wanting. There was a formal finding of breach of fiduciary duty. The quiet title action was voided. The property sale was permanently halted. The judge looked at Renata's parents over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who has seen this exact story in different costumes many times. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said the words that transferred full, clear, unencumbered ownership of the Eastwick property to Renata Lee Blake, and the clerk stamped the order, and that was that. Renata's father sat in the courtroom after it was over, and did not move for a long time. Her mother walked out quickly, head up, the particular posture of someone who will spend the drive home recasting this as someone else's failure. Renata noticed both of these things. She filed them away. She walked out of the courthouse with Diane, and stood on the steps in the October light. "What are you going to do with it?" Diane asked. Renata had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it in the field, and in the middle of night shifts, and on the drive over that morning. She had the land now. She had the 47,000. She was 31 years old, and she had 2 assets her grandfather had seen fit to give her, and 1 life her parents had not managed to compress into the shape they needed. "Build something," she said. Diane smiled. It was the first time Renata had seen her smile, and it changed her whole face. "Good answer." The paperwork took another 3 weeks. The deed transfer was recorded clean and final on a Friday in November. Diane sent her a scan of it that evening. Renata Lee Blake, sole owner, Eastwick County, all the formal language that meant simply, "This is yours." Renata printed it out. She framed it. She hung it on the wall of her apartment above the small desk where she did her paperwork, where she planned her budget, where she had sat so many nights running the numbers of her savings account and calculating how much longer until she could afford to leave. The answer, it turned out, had been in the probate records all along. She did not call her parents. They called her once about a month later. Her father, not her mother. And the conversation was brief and careful and did not contain an apology, because apologies require the admission of something. And admitting something had not yet become available to David Blake. Renata listened. She said very little. She did not close the door entirely, because she was not her parents and she did not use silence as a weapon. But she did not open it wide, either. Tanya she kept. Slowly, carefully, through phone calls that were sometimes awkward and sometimes genuinely warm. Through one lunch in February where they talked for 3 hours and both cried once and laughed twice, and didn't solve anything except the immediate problem of sitting in the same room again. Tanya was finding her own way out of the gravitational pull. It was slow work. Renata knew what slow work felt like. Spring came. She hired a surveyor for the Eastwick property and had coffee with a local architect whose work she had admired and who had many ideas about what could be built on 2 acres with a tree-line view. She did not rush. She had learned, finally, that she did not have to rush, that the land had been waiting 11 years and could wait a little longer while she figured out exactly what she wanted. She worked her shifts. She packed her lunches. She slept, most nights, without waking at 3 in the morning. And on clear days when the light was good, she would sometimes pull up the scan of the deed on her phone and just look at it for a moment. Not because she needed to confirm it was real, but because her grandfather had spent his whole life making something out of almost nothing, and she wanted to remember that she came from that. She was going somewhere. She had always been going somewhere. She just hadn't known, until now, that he had already been watching for it.